Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 1 of Mr. Martino's Ledger, a podcast where we're going to discuss the history of accounting and make sure that it's very fun, no boring conversations allowed here. Now, our first episode is going to be about ancient Mesopotamia, so we are going to go all the way back. And as for me, I'm your co-host. My name is Mackenzie. I'm the CEO and co-founder of HashBasis, a crypto-native accounting firm based here in San Francisco. And I absolutely love history, which is why we are doing this podcast. And I can't wait to chat about and also learn about, the history of accounting. There's a lot to talk about here.
And I'm Courtney, your co-host and co-founder of HashBasis. And I am so excited to dive into the history of ancient accounting and can't wait to learn more about how it relates to what we do every day.
Yes, for sure. Since we are doing crypto accounting, you might think, like, how is there a connection between ancient Mesopotamia and crypto accounting? But I assure you, there is. And we're going to be discussing that at the end of this episode. So, real quick, if you haven't listened to our trailer yet, go ahead and do that. We list out just a little bit more about who we are and also the various episodes and seasons that we're going to have. We're starting with Mesopotamia and then kind of going through ancient civilizations, through the Renaissance, Enlightenment, modern day, future of accounting, all that kind of good stuff. So be sure to listen to that if you haven't already. So, all right, with that though, let's go literally all the way back to the beginning of civilization. And we're going to be talking about a region called Mesopotamia, which I'm sure all of us learned about probably. I learned about it in my 4th grade social studies class. That was where I was first introduced to it. And it's basically the area between modern day Turkey, and then it goes down through Syria, and then it ends in Iraq. And it's also called the ancient Near East. And it's in between 2 rivers called the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. And you also might have heard about those in your history classes, because I remember I certainly did. And just think of it as like 2 rivers, and then the middle of them is what we would call Mesopotamia. And definitely recommend like looking at a map because that will definitely help situate you a little bit more. We're also going to link a very fun video in the show notes here. So I was just on YouTube looking at ancient Mesopotamian videos, as one does. And there's a really hilarious song where I think it's a history teacher. He's like singing about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, but to the tune of Soulja Boy. I won't sing it now because I'll totally butcher it, but yeah, I highly would recommend watching that video because it's honestly so catchy. I know, Courtney, you really liked it too. So 10 out of 10.
It took me right back to my college days. I had a teammate who was a big fan of the Soldier Boy song. So hearing that, it just took me right back there, but in the most fun way. You have to check it out.
Yeah, those kinds of videos are certainly the best. So anyway, after that, there's a lot of different civilizations that are included within the term Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia doesn't really refer to a country or anything like that. It's more so a broad term. And this is also spanning a really long period of time. So we're talking about roughly like 4000 BCE to roughly like 500, 550 BCE. And BCE just stands for before Common Era. So kind of like before the era of the Romans and Christ. It's like the amount of time going before that. So hopefully that's not confusing, but just know this is really, really old stuff that we're talking about. And there's a couple of main civilizations, though, that are included within this broad term of Mesopotamia. So we're going to go ahead and chat about those. The first people or civilization were called the Sumerians. They are the earliest known civilization of southern Mesopotamia. So they can really be considered like the first civilization that we know of that had writing, which is honestly pretty amazing. And they actually are credited with the first forms of writing called cuneiform. And we're going to talk a lot more about that. They appear to have advanced religious systems as well. They had ziggurats, which are like large temples, like large Sumerian temples. I definitely recommend looking at a picture of those. They're pretty impressive. And they also had cities, like maybe not in the modern sense of like a New York or a San Francisco or London, but they definitely had city-states, and some famous ones are and Uruk. So it's spelled U-R for and then Uruk is just U-R-U-K. And there's a very famous piece of literature that originated in Sumeria. It's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And it's a tale about a dude named Gilgamesh. He was the king of Uruk. And I actually read this a couple years ago. I was really into ancient literature. I was, like, trying to read this and, like, the Tale of Genji, which is a Japanese work, and at least the Epic of Gilgamesh was really amazing. It's written in verse, like, it almost feels like poetry. And it's just really universal. Like Gilgamesh is dealing with a lot of human stuff. Like he's trying to find the meaning in life. He's got some friendship drama. He's thinking about his own mortality. And so this is probably based on a real person, and it's so old. It's like 6,000 years old, if not more than that. So yeah, the Sumerians really were the OGs, but they weren't the only ones. There's also the Akkadians, and they formed the aptly named Akkadian Empire. There was a famous king of Akkad. He was called Sargon. We're going to talk about them a little bit more. And his whole thing was that he united Sumeria and Akkad into what we think is the first major empire. It extended a little bit beyond a city state to become like an actual empire. The next guys we're going to talk about are the Babylonians, and they are from the city of Babylon. These names are very creative. And their main claim to fame is that they had really influential legal codes, and it's just considered overall like a golden age for Mesopotamia. There was science, astronomy, architecture, and the most famous guy here was our man Hammurabi. You've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi before. It's basically a bunch of laws inscribed in stone, 282 laws to be exact. The theme was basically an eye for an eye. And in law, there's actually a term for this. It's called lex talionis, which means the law of retaliation. So, yeah, they didn't beat around the bush. I've got some examples here. So, for example, if a builder's work causes a house to collapse and it kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. But if the collapse kills the owner's son, then the builder's son is put to death. So you can really see how it's that eye for an eye, law of retaliation, that kind of thing. And another law that I thought was kind of funny, maybe not funny, but it says if a woman is found to be unfaithful, she and her lover can be bound and thrown into the water, but the husband can save his wife if he desires. So how nice of him. That's great. And just the last law I want to touch on is if a person is caught committing robbery, they shall be put to death. So nice and succinct. So that's how Hammurabi feels about that. Two other civilizations to chat about. One are the Assyrians, not to be confused with the Akkadians. Those are like the same thing in my mind, but they're not. They're two different groups of people. Now, the Assyrians are in northern Mesopotamia, so closer to what we would think of as modern day Turkey. And I think they were more of like an ancient military superpower. They had a bureaucracy, vast empire, etc. And the last people are the Neo-Babylonians, and so I think there's two Babylonians. There's like the original Babylonians, which is more of like Hammurabi's jam, and then you have the Neo-Babylonians, and they're like the later rulers of Babylon. Their famous king was Nebuchadnezzar, and I remember learning about Nebuchadnezzar in vacation Bible school. So put a pin in that. But they also had the legendary Hanging Gardens. Like if you've heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, it's from this Babylon. It's from the Neo-Babylons. And speaking of vacation Bible school, a lot of these civilizations were actually discussed in the Bible first. Like I think Genesis mentions some of these civilizations, and a lot of modern day Iraq, which is where Mesopotamia like largely was. A lot of excavations have actually been done there, and it's starting to confirm a lot of what was written about in the Bible. So it's honestly really cool to have these super ancient accounts that we might have heard about or grown up with, and then we actually start to see evidence that yeah, like these were real things. Gilgamesh was maybe not a real person, but maybe there was someone who was like him that did actually exist. So, yeah, I've only read parts of the Bible. I've not read the whole thing, but I did watch VeggieTales growing up, which is basically Bible stories told by vegetables. You guys should really watch it. It's really funny, but I do remember them talking about Nebuchadnezzar. There was an episode about him that I really remember. And I'll also link one of my other favorite VeggieTale songs, which was the Hairbrush song. I don't need to say more about that.
There's just something about a tomato and a cucumber explaining the Bible that just sets it off.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with checking it out.
And I remember it to this day. I literally will never forget seeing Larry the Cucumber in a bath towel. It's hilarious. So anyway, though, okay, so that's just some backstory just to situate us. We're in Mesopotamia. We're by the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, spanning from modern-day Turkey all the way down through Syria and Iraq. So that's where we are. Now, let's actually go to the accounting piece, what accounting was like in ancient Mesopotamia. And actually, there's a wealth of evidence here and knowledge. And so I got so into the research for this, I'm almost embarrassed to admit it. Now, the reason why we know so much is because we have clay tablets that have survived from this period. And we actually have hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, and yet probably more to be discovered. And these clay tablets are written in cuneiform. Cuneiform is really important because it's the earliest known system of writing. So when Hammurabi is like writing out his laws on his stone, it's being written in cuneiform. And these started out as pictographic symbols on clay, but they developed more into what's called a wedge-shaped script. Represents words and sounds, but the common theme here is that they're all written on these clay tablets. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of these. Archaeologists have uncovered a lot, and there's really probably way more to be discovered still. And they've survived because they're clay. Clay is extremely durable. Once it's made, it bakes in the sun, and it just can last for literally thousands of years. So really excited to see all the new research that's going to come out about this as well. But before we get to the clay tablets, there's actually a whole other topic that we need to cover. And it's going to be clay tokens. So not clay tablets just yet. We're actually going to do a deep dive on clay tokens, which are very integral to our story. Now, the primary source for the research that I was doing on this is actually an academic paper. It's called How Writing Came About by Denise Schmant-Becerra. I think that's how you say it. And this is written in 1996. A lot of the research, I think, is still like pretty confirmed and well regarded. So Denise's theory was that cuneiform writing emerged from an accounting system using clay tokens, not just from pictographs. Now, I was originally kind of confused about this because I didn't really know what pictographs meant, but pictographic theory just means that scholars thought writing came about from drawings. So people would just draw things, and then that somehow sort of turned into a system of writing. But her theory was saying no, it actually came from like writing developed out of an accounting system. So writing comes from accounting. And this I find to just be absolutely fascinating. Like people think accounting is just like, oh, back office, not that important, like not sexy profession, which, it's not the sexiest profession in the world, but without it, we wouldn't have writing. So at least according to this theory.
I was just going to add, I think this theory debunks that accounting is actually very sexy because it formed the original form of writing, right? Like if you go way back into her theory and what we're about to discuss with clay tokens and clay tablets, it is extremely fascinating and how they tracked it. That was the part that I got so hung up on what we're about to discuss. It's really great.
Yeah. So can't wait to dive into all of this because there's a lot of research that we did on the clay tokens. But before we get into that, though, I found this really great quote in Denise's paper. It's by this guy, Colin Cherry. I don't really know who he is. I tried looking him up, but I didn't see anything about him. But anyway, he had this quote, and it goes, "Man's development and the growth of civilizations have depended on progress in a few activities: the discovery of fire, domestication of animals, the division of labor, but above all, in the evolution of means to receive, to communicate, and to record his knowledge, and especially in the development of phonetic writing." So this gentleman is essentially saying, yeah, like fire is cool, livestock, agriculture is important, but really what enabled humans to rise to the next level was writing and communication, therefore accounting. So yeah, I thought that was just a very nice quote to tie everything together. But okay, let's go more into what the tokens actually are, though. Tokens are small clay counters that indicate commodities. So just imagine like a tiny little token made out of clay, almost like a bead you can think of, and it represented different commodities like grain, oil, sheep, days of labor. And based on my understanding, you basically just roll balls of clay like in your hands, and then you pinch it and shape it into different shapes depending on what you're trying to make. And I definitely recommend looking up some images of this. We'll link some in the show notes too, but some of them are just like plain circular type tokens. You have some, they're called ovoid shaped tokens. So they look like kind of like an oval or like a cone. You have some that they kind of look like Oh, what am I thinking of? They kinda look like, pot stickers or, wontons or something like that. Like, some or like fortune cookies, some of them look like little ghosts. One of them actually kinda reminds me of the Phantom logo, like the crypto wallet. But just think of, like, cute, tiny little shapes made in clay, and this is what we call clay tokens. And they all represented, again, like, different commodities or different, days of work, like, different items that people wanted to track back then. Now, these clay tokens are super old, like, they go back way before cuneiform. Denise, she's theorizing that the tokens were starting to be used from around 8,000 BCE until about 3,000, and then that's when the cuneiform kinda took over from there. So, yeah, these clay tokens are, what, 10,000 years old, if not a little bit more, so these are very proto writing, but they were kinda like the first step in writing.
So was there like a reference library or something similar that they referenced to know what each token represented? For example, if I was going to trade sheep for barley or something similar to that, and I created tokens that represented sheep, how would my counterpart or who I'm dealing with know that those tokens represent sheep? Does that make sense? How did they
Yeah.
all know what each one represented?
No, it's a great question because as we'll discuss in a little bit, there's a lot of these different types of tokens, and you can make different lines or incisions on them that slightly change their meaning. So I think they were just so ubiquitous that people kind of knew what they were, especially if you were in business or you had a farm and you transacted, like you had to kind of know what these tokens were. But also scribes, gotta love the scribes. We're also going to talk about them. They were the ones responsible probably for a lot of this, and maybe they weren't called scribes in 8,000 BCE, maybe there's, like, another word for it, but there's definitely people who it was kind of like their job to know what these types of tokens were. It's basically like another language before there was a written language, like a clay token language, if you will. So, not to make it more confusing, but Denise is theorizing that there are multiple types of tokens. She breaks them down to two categories. She says, okay, one, there's plain tokens, and then number two, there's complex tokens. So, as the name suggests, plain tokens are simple geometric shapes. So, think of cones or like spheres, discs, cylinders, also tetrahedrons, which doesn't seem that plain to me, but these are plain tokens and they represent things like basic commodities like grain, oil, barley, that kind of stuff. Now, contrast that with the complex tokens, and these are just more elaborate shapes, and they also have more elaborate markings on them, like different lines or incisions. And these tended to represent manufactured goods, processed foods, luxury items. And she notes that the rise of complex tokens also coincided with the rise of these mega temple complexes because religion, as I mentioned, was definitely more organized in these city states than you might imagine. And then also it coincided with the rise of agriculture, especially with these early plain tokens, maybe from the 8,000s and the 6,000s BCE when agriculture was really just becoming a thing. That's when we start to see more of these plain tokens. Now, what's really fascinating about the token methodology is that it's what we call concrete accounting. So it's very literal, very one to one. So, for example, if you wanted to represent three oil jars, you would need three oval shaped tokens. So it's not like one token represents many, it's one to one. So what we have today, like in our normal mathematical system, is abstract numbers, abstract accounting. We can just have one symbol that represents many. It wasn't like that back then, so you can only imagine how like onerous this becomes if you're trying to track like 1,000 sheep. You need 1,000 sheep tokens. So yeah, definitely not very convenient.
Yeah, this like I've already touched on keeping track myself, just trying to figure that out, but storing it, like I know that we're going to touch on this eventually. We'll get to the temples and things of that sort, but the storage capacity needed for, like you just mentioned, 1,000 tokens of some sort. That part to me as well is fascinating that you're not going to lose them, making sure that you track them. It's very
Yeah, and
interesting.
I'm sure they did lose them. I'm sure that created a lot of problems back in the day. But they did have one innovation to sort of address this problem. Later on, tokens were sealed in hollow clay balls or like hollow clay jars. You can think of it. called bullae or bullae. There's actually a word for these. And they stored them there for safety and so they couldn't be tampered with. So I think once they started to have all these clay tokens, they were like, oh shoot, it's like really hard to actually hold these. I keep like losing these. So they just started sealing them in these clay jars. But then the problem, of course, is that once you put all this stuff in a clay jar, you don't really know what's in it. So then the scribes would start to like write on the outside or not write. They would basically, it's called impressing. They would impress the token shapes onto the outside of these clay jars so that they know what was inside. And this is where the terminology clay envelopes starts to come into play a lot. And instead of being called like clay jars, they were called clay envelopes. And so there'd be token shapes on the outside. Sometimes the scribes would also put their unique seal on it, which lets them know the contents of the jar, but it also kind of creates like the first kind of contract because someone is actually signing something, right? They're putting their seal on it saying, yes, I authorize or I confirm the contents of what's in here.
Almost like an auditor?
I don't know if they're an auditor, but more so like the original accountant. Like they're saying, yes, this is what's in here. I don't know if they had like audit at this point in time, but they at least had someone put on the outside what was actually in there. So more, I think that's more like, I guess, analogous to bookkeeping. Okay, so there's a gentleman we're going to introduce. His name is Leo Oppenheim. Not Oppenheimer. That's a different dude. This is Leo Oppenheim from the University of Chicago. He actually was the guy that had the initial breakthrough on this type of research. There was a hollow jar or like a tablet that was discovered in the late 1920s in northern Iraq. It was kind of shaped like an egg. At least that's what the like the study or the paper said. And there was both an egg-shaped tablet and then there was like a normal tablet that was accompanying it. Now, there was a script on the outside of the hollow tablet, and it actually had descriptions of what was inside the jar. So, for example, the script said counters representing the small cattle, and then it lists out a bunch of cattle. So it says 2 ewes, 6 female lambs, 8 full-grown male sheep, 4 male lambs, 6 she-goats, that kid, 1 he-goat, and 3 female kids. And then it says the seal of Zikaru, the shepherd. So I'm guessing this is somebody's name. And so this is an example of like what the contents are on the inside being represented on the outside. And then when they actually opened this jar, there were 49 these token counters or clay tokens inside. And I know I went through those numbers quickly, but if you were to add up all those numbers, they equal 49. So this is really important because this is basically the Rosetta Stone of the token system. I think before this was discovered, historians or archaeologists didn't really know what the clay tokens were for, or especially what the hollow jars with the tokens inside, what they were for. But now we know, right? It's just a way to denote on the outside what's on the inside. So once we discovered that, then it became pretty clear what these objects were for.
So this was a means of keeping track of each one's inventory. Is that fair to say?
I definitely think so. Yeah, because if you're the owner of this cattle, you could just go ahead, look at your clay envelope, and be like, oh, this is exactly what I have.
And if you lose a lamb, you just remove a token?
I guess so. That's what I was thinking too. Like, if one of your lambs goes off a cliff or something like that, do you have to break the jar and remove one of the lambs? That I'm not entirely, I don't know how that went down, but I'm sure that happened.
I was just curious, like if you go to the temple and had a lamb that got ill, I'm down a lamb, please adjust my inventory. I'm just like fascinated on thinking about how this transpired.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I think the reason why we don't know these things is because this wasn't actually writing. We don't have any cuneiform like clay tablets that go into this, but yeah, I'm sure those were very real, not only like agricultural problems, but also accounting problems, right? It must have been very difficult to know how much you actually owned of anything at any given point in time. So, yeah, I think that's a great point. And the thing that's also really interesting to me is how specific all of these tokens got. Like, it's not just there wasn't just like 5 tokens, there were a lot of different variations. And the paper that we referenced also has like all these tables of different types of clay tokens, their variations, and what they mean. So, for example, like one of the categories is I'll go with paraboloids. I think that's just fun to say. Basically, it's a token that looks like a parabola. It's shaped like an inverted U. And there's like different variations in terms of how you can incise them or put lines on them. So one of them is just plain. It's like a plain parabola. There's another parabola that maybe has like 3 short lines incised on it. There's another parabola that has 6 lines incised on it. Some have dots, some have holes in the middle, some have like a double ring around the inside of the parabola. And so, yeah, a lot of these are just, I guess back to your point, Courtney, I don't know how people like really kept track of these. Because even just within the ones we found so far, there's so much variation. But luckily this problem was basically solved, or at least it was iterated on. So around 3300 BCE, our good friends, the Sumerian scribes, began impressing token shapes directly onto clay tablet surfaces rather than sealing actual physical 3D tokens inside these envelopes. So what that means, impressing just means you take your clay token and then you just sort of smush it into a clay tablet and then it leaves some kind of impression. That's what we mean by that. And so you're not sealing them in something, you're just sort of making an image of them on a long, flat clay tablet. And so the next innovation was that they incised the shape of the tokens onto the clay tablets directly with a stylus. And a stylus is kind of just like an ancient pen. So they pretty much had the shape already, but then they just, I guess, drew it or incised it onto the clay tablet. And that's all incising means. It's just drawing the outline. You're not pressing a 3D object into some kind of tablet. So that way it became way more legible, right? Like a lot of these tokens that we're describing, they had a bunch of lines on them, like very intricate patterns and designs. And that was kind of hard to impress because, as you can imagine, that kind of detail just gets a little bit smushed and it just sort of gets lost in the detail. But incising is just a lot more legible. So that was kind of the final stage of how cuneiform actually developed. So you basically started with your 3D tokens and then you started sealing them in the envelopes. Then from there, you're like, oh, let's just impress the tokens directly into the clay. From there, you just incise the shapes directly into the clay. And then from there, you have cuneiform. So that's how we go from accounting with these tokens to actual writing. And again, the paper has some really good diagrams here of it shows like the actual 3D token, like what that would have looked like in a drawing. And then it shows what the pictograph would have been in cuneiform, more like the 2D version of it, and also what it means. So yeah, honestly, I think it's so cool that we're able to see how this progression actually happened. And also keep in mind like the time scale of all this. It took roughly 5,000 years to go from the clay tokens to actually having cuneiform. And that's, I don't know about you, Courtney, but that's like a really long time. So
Feels like forever.
I know. So just a couple of things to cover on the cuneiform side. So, what are some of the benefits of cuneiform over the clay token? So, first one is kind of obvious, like what we just discussed. The information was held permanently in one place. You don't have a million loose tokens everywhere. As you mentioned, it's like you could lose one, something could happen, but now that problem is just eliminated. They are just on one clay tablet. Now, the tablets could also hold more information by virtue of the medium. So, for example, specific parts of the tablet were reserved for recording particular types of data. So, for example, the sign for the recipient of a transaction, so whoever's like, receiving something, their symbol was placed below the symbol indicating the goods. So, it kind of reminded me of a modern day ledger, I suppose. Like, your debits go, where your credits go, and they go there just because that's the way that the system works. This is the first example where we see some kind of accounting system emerging on an actual document, specific places for specific things. So I thought that was really cool. And then the other thing, oh my gosh, Courtney, I actually did a little bit of research on this before we started recording. So I guess the Mesopotamians just created numbers, like numerals, I suppose. So they were also like, okay, we can't one-to-one count everything because that's just way too much. And again, very inefficient. And so we're talking about like they had math before the ancient Greeks, like Pythagoras or Euclid or like any of those dudes before they really, I suppose, codified it. They were able to make the leap from concrete numbers, so one-to-one, to abstract numbers, more like what we have today. Now, it's not exactly like what we have today. When I was researching this, the Sumerians or Mesopotamians had a sexagesimal system, which is basically base 60. Courtney, do we use base 10? I think that's what our numbers are based on.
I was just about to say base 60. What is this? Okay.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
continue on.
Yeah, so they decided to use base 60, and they had different representations for numbers in cuneiform. using basic wedge symbols. So, for example, a single wedge meant a 1. And I have a picture up here. A wedge just kind of means like, at least in the picture, it's like almost like the number 1 and then a little flag. Like that's what they're calling the wedge. Um, that would be their number 1. And then a corner wedge. So without it's like the long line of the 1, literally just like a little flag pointing to the left. That is a wedge, and that stood for 10. So you could just combine, like, basically went up to 50 on the x-axis and then up to 9 on the y-axis, and then you got 59. And so this really blew my mind because today we have 60 seconds in a minute, we have 60 minutes in an hour. So even though our society is base 10, we're still using like some of these super ancient base 60 measurements to record things as fundamental as time. So how's that for mind blowing?
Mind blown. I'm like still wrapping my head around how like we have modern technology today and we are able to search transactions, label transactions, categorize transactions, things of that nature. But here, the scribes in the past, what they were dealing with tracking and figuring out what each clay token was, like that to me, just trying to understand the technology that we're given now and how we utilize it, how it could compare to what they did back then in Mesopotamia. But I just like can't wrap my head around it. It just seems vastly different, even though you're tying it together and showing us how it evolved.
I mean, it's definitely sophisticated for being an ancient civilization. Like they had math and they were writing out their transactions, not on a computer, of course, but on, it wasn't that long ago. Humans were just using paper to write everything down. So it's like, really, what's the difference? It's just like a different language. So yeah, I was also thinking about that too. And the other major innovation besides math was that writing became phonetic. And this is almost like a bigger deal because the scribes realized they could use these cuneiform signs, these wedges, to represent sounds rather than objects. And so I actually have an example down here, which came from one of the papers. So there's a name in ancient Mesopotamia called Enlil T, and I'll spell that for you. The first section is Enlil dash Ti. And so it means Enlil gives life. And I think Enlil was like one of the ancient Sumerian gods or Mesopotamian gods. And you could actually write it out using a pictograph or the cuneiform sign for a god, which looks like a star to represent the sound Enlil. And then there's a pictograph for life, which is an arrow that represents the sound T. So you're basically using sounds. You're sounding out what you're writing versus just using a picture to represent the god. Now, I know it's kind of confusing, but just think about the way that we write, like when babies learn to speak, we're like, ah, ooh, like those are sounds that then come together to make words. And we take that for granted, but it had to come from somewhere, right? And the Mesopotamians were really the first civilizations to actually be doing this. So scribes realized then that they could basically just write anything because they weren't limited just to pictographic symbols of drawings that represent things. They could actually write anything that had a sound, right? That was coming from a human voice. And it sounds like this was actually more of a necessity versus some kind of philosophical or creative thing because the scribes had to record donor names. So if you donated to the temple, the scribes had to record your name. And if you were a worker, the scribes had to record your name to record the wages that you got. But there weren't symbols for people's names, right? It's not like a generic symbol for barley or for water. It's like some dude's name, right? And so that's why they had to move to the phonetic system so that they could get more flexibility and be able to write anything. So I thought that was kind of interesting. It's, what do they say? Like, necessity is the mother of all invention. I think this is a perfect example of that. So the next part is what was actually written on these tablets. And we kind of alluded to this a little bit, but some basic things like recording deliveries of goods like grain, livestock, records of taxes, because yes, there were taxes. There's always been taxes. Payments to workers, how much they got paid. And most of the times payments were in kind, meaning they were in grain. That's what people actually used to eat. And so there's rules and laws like the Code of Hammurabi, letters, donations, loan agreements, which we're going to chat about in a second because the concept of credit was actually a thing back in the day. Contracts for sale of land, lists of workers and factories, and then also literature, right? Like the Epic of Gilgamesh was written in cuneiform on one of these tablets, well, across many tablets. So it really just shows you the, I guess, the ingenuity, the creativity that this really did unlock.
In detail too, right? Like we get emails to update something or some sort of form of communication that way. And it's fairly easy to take care of, right? It doesn't take very long to resolve. But I'm thinking about coming in visit to a temple to see a scribe to record a loan agreement and the time that that might take or the detail that might need to go into recording something like that compared to today.
Yeah, those scribes would be taking a long time probably to write out that loan agreement. Because also, I think once you actually made the impressions in the tablet, you had to like leave it out in the sun to dry. This wasn't a thing that happened immediately. It's not like an email. You had to like give it time. A quick sidebar: when I was actually in high school, I took a class called, I think it was like it's like ancient history or something. It was really funny. Our biology teacher was like really into history, so he started teaching this class. And I remember one of the first projects that we did was actually write cuneiform on a clay tablet. So I remember he gave everyone like pottery clay basically, and then he gave us the cuneiform alphabet and we had to write something on it. And I remember doing that and then we just had to leave it out to dry for such a long time. But it's really durable. My mom still has it like in her china cabinet, which is like so hilarious. I don't even remember what it says, but actually going through that process of doing it myself, I was like, "Wow, this takes a lot of time, but man, like, it definitely lasts a long time." So, yeah, Courtney, I'd recommend. I feel like you and your kids would have a lot of fun doing that.
I have to admit, I did take a pottery class in high school, so I can relate to the time that it takes. But I'm just like fascinated about the detail that would go into it compared to what we do for everyday updates or changes and things of that sort. I just like that part to me is being able to have the patience that they displayed. I'm just like amazed by envisioning going into a temple to see a scribe to create a loan agreement, but you can only fill out so much of that loan agreement because the clay has to dry, right? Like, I wonder how that transpired, or what that all looked like.
I think they just had to be way more intentional about it. And keep in mind, like these big temples, which yeah, but we can probably talk about that now. Like these were huge complexes that were going on. So it wasn't like there was just one scribe that was doing everything. Like being a scribe was a legit profession and you were actually thought very highly of. So the temples were basically the ancient equivalent of banks. They were the center of religious life, but also economic life as well. And actually reminded me, speaking of vacation Bible school, so, like, Jesus's whole thing was that he wanted not his whole thing, he had a lot of things, but one of his things was that he, like, was trying to expel the moneylenders from the temple, and I really remember learning about that back in the day, like, he'd go to the temple, and I think he flipped tables or something, if I recall, but he was trying to, like, divorce money from religion, and that just tells you how prevalent it actually was back then. The temple was a whole system, and it's actually called a redistributive system. So think of it that there were transactions coming in, there were people paying rent, there were spoils of war, gifts or donations to the temple. So those are your inflows and tax payments. That's obviously a huge one. And then also outgoing payments. So payments to workers, outgoing rations to the community, payment to people, building certain works or projects. And so it was kind of like it wasn't a corporation or anything, but it was kind of like the ancient prototype of it, in the sense that there were transactions coming in and transactions going out in one centralized location. And I also wanted to point out that these are goods that we're dealing with. Today, we're very used to paper currency or cryptocurrencies, but back in the day, they didn't have that. This is before money. People would give what they had, so physical goods like cattle, livestock, sheep, barley, silver, clothing, actual physical goods that people can use in their everyday lives. And I know Courtney, you're mentioning loans and stuff like that. Loans and promissory notes were a thing in Babylonian temples, and the temples were they were on the other side. So they were the creditors in the transaction, and then individuals would come to the temple to get loans from them. And it's kind of blows my mind how established this was because there were actually tablets that have been found that have listed rates for commodities, basically monthly exchange rates to see how much someone owed someone else. So there'd be like published monthly table saying, oh, maybe like 1 sheep is equal to 3 barley. And so, yeah, that's a market right there. At least that's what it seems like to me. And we even have documentation that some of the interest rates were pretty high as 20% or 33%. So, yeah, it was not cheap to borrow from the temple, it seems like. But yeah, we have some stories about this, right, Courtney?
There was a temple in Mari in what is today Syria. And archaeologists found a tablet there that documents a temple loan in which a temple takes the debtor's wife as a pawn for the loan. Instead of standard collateral, the debtor's wife was accepted by the temple as a guarantee for repayment of the debt. Now that's a story for you.
Imagine if Nikhil, who is my husband, like put me up as collateral for his debt. Our marriage wouldn't last very long if that was the case.
Yeah, I was thinking something similar as well. It's very fascinating the thought process back then.
Yeah, that guy does not he's not the husband of the year, obviously. Wow. Times are different back then. You could literally just put people as collateral, which is so awful. But yeah, anyway, thank you for that story. We have some more where that came from. But okay, let's talk a little bit more about the scribes because we keep chatting about them. Um, and so real quick, so I think scribes are just hilarious because my friend Tyler, he actually dressed up as a scribe for Halloween one year and he looked hilarious. He had like a little beret on and he had these like really ornate robes on and he had a little pen. And if I recall, there was a feather in his cap. So every time I think of scribes, I think of my friend just like looking like a total goofball. But anyway, scribes were basically early accountants. Um, and the rise of these professional scribes was tied to these temples also becoming more prominent. So they did things like what we would normally think a scribe would do, like they recorded transactions, recorded deals, ensured compliance with legal codes. And I found that you were penalized if you did not document transactions properly. I don't know, maybe Hammurabi would like take their hand, like cut their hand off or something. And so I think the penalties were pretty steep. And so you were incentivized to be as accurate as possible, which my goodness, imagine if we messed up an entry today and then like I don't know, someone took a finger off, that would just be, like, wild, so I'm kinda glad that, we've developed beyond that, but, yeah, it took years to become a legitimate, like, an actual professional scribe. At least in Mesopotamia, they trained in Edinburgh, and that is known as, like, the House of Tablets, which how cool is that? I kinda wish we named hash bases House of Tablets, that'd be really cool, but most were boys, and they started at a very young age, so around 7 or 8, usually from wealthy families because this kind of education wasn't cheap, right? Now, there were typically 4 stages of instruction, so you learn the basics of cuneiform, so that's where you are first introduced to all these different shapes and what they mean, what they sound like. Then you'd copy and memorize them. You would look at and read text and literature, like maybe the Epic of Gilgamesh, and then you would become a master. But becoming a master doesn't seem like it was so easy. It could take over a decade because it was really intense. But, once you actually did become a scribe, then you were set for life, right? Like you had a very respected, very influential career. And also you were probably around like some pretty high up people in society. You were around the priests, you were around the king and his court, like the landowners, people that actually needed writing, probably were on the upper echelons of society back in the day. Now, one thing I also want to touch on is that according to Perplexity, there's also evidence that there were female scribes in Mesopotamia, like women could have jobs as scribes, which is so cool. And there's actually kind of a famous one. Her name is Enneduanna. Beautiful name, by the way. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who was the king of Acadia that we actually mentioned earlier as well. So yeah, women could do stuff, at least like have like professional careers back in Mesopotamia, which I just absolutely love. So I just to zoom out a little bit, there's like hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that have been discovered, but there are several famous archives or collections that are more what you'd consider like accounting cuneiform or accounting types of transactions. And I'll just run through a list of a couple of them. So there's the Uruk tablets, which talk about barley and goods. So very exciting. There's the Kushim tablets, which talk about beer production, and we're actually going to do a deep dive on that one. There are the Umma tablets, and those talk about taxation and distributions. The Drehem archives, which I think are probably one of the more popular ones, those dive into temple accounting, which is why, I think they're a good example. And then the Jemdet Nasser tablets, which is economic record keeping. So as you can see, there's a ton of tablets that have been discovered, and they all have seemingly droll topics. But as we'll see in the Kushim tablets, it's not as boring as you might think. So, yeah, Courtney, tell us about our friend Kushim.
Kushim tablets. This is a fun one. So the Kushim tablets date way back. I believe 18 tablets survive today. And it documents the flow of barley, which is the main ingredient in beer. It documents the flow in and out of the brewery, the production rates, and the beer distributed to various officials. And it's fascinating because they managed about 135,000 liters of barley. And this produced accounting ratios where they could calculate things such as grains consumed versus beer produced. And how fun is that to think about those calculations back then, with what they were given compared to how we do things today? And something else too, just to mention, there was a measurement and a conversion system, and in general, the Mesopotamian cultures had standardized ratios. Like the workers received monthly barley ratios based on their status and role. Adult men typically received 60 quarts per month, and women received 30 quarts per month. So it turns out that in one of the Kushim tablets, our friend made a calculation error. And on one side of the tablet, it records the amount of barley received to the facility, measured in bowls, and those totals would be tallied, and then the total amount would be written on the reverse side of the tablet. But the issue or the error that was discovered was that on one side of the tablet, it showed 3,910 bowls. However, on the other side of the tablet, it stated 3,895 bowls. So some 15 bowls short. So I guess the question remains, was it an error? Could there be fraud involved, or how to decipher that?
Hopefully, he didn't lose a hand over it or something. But yeah, the important thing, though, to know is that the Mesopotamians didn't have double entry bookkeeping that we know of. It was mostly, I would consider it like single entry. There was no debits or no credits in the modern sense that we have. They didn't really have accounts that like retained earnings didn't exist back then. There was no financial statements. It was way more focused on counting and, again, as I mentioned, doing like single entry style, almost like narrative. Like this person gave this many handfuls of silver to the temple, and then the temple went ahead and spent that on building a project. Numbers were involved, but it wasn't as regimented as it is today. The last topic for today is a Code of Hammurabi. And we kind of teased this already, but I figured it deserved its own section because it's just so well known. And especially when I used to study art history quite a bit, and the Code of Hammurabi was always a section we discussed in art history and then also in like normal world history as well. So I just wanted to dive a little bit more into it. So first off, Hammurabi, the king, he ruled Babylon from around 1792 to 1750 BCE. So honestly, pretty long for a ruler back in those days. And he was really innovative, not just in the legal field, like with this Code of Hammurabi, but also in accounting. Because as we know, even in modern day accounting, like we need legal contractual support to recognize things like revenue. Like in ASC 606, which is recognizing revenue with a customer, the first step is identify the contract, right? Like what kind of documentation is there to support this transactions? And even day to day, like practically whenever a customer has a complex transaction or something I'm not sure about, the first question I always ask is, hey, where's the contract for this so we can determine the right treatment under GAAP for it. So Hammurabi, he was way ahead of the curve. He was doing this way before it was cool or before we had like the FASB. So the Code of Hammurabi are essentially just laws that are inscribed on a large stone stele. And a stele is just, yeah, a big upright slab of stone. And he claims that he got these laws from Shamash, who is the Babylonian god of justice. He's receiving the law directly from the god, which reinforces the legitimacy of the laws and his right to rule, or his claim to the throne, his legitimacy. And this idea is as old as time itself. Rulers claiming that they have a divine right to rule, so that's why other people have to follow them, right? It was super innovative in the way that it came across. So, some specific accounting provisions included a provision for collateralized loans, which is hilarious because we still talk about collateralized loans today. Laws 49 through 51 establish principles for using property as loan collateral, creating essentially like early secured lending practices, like a mortgage, right? That's like what you do. You put up your house as collateral, you get money for it. They kind of had a similar thing back then. Now, along with that, there were interest rates, debt restructuring, there were regulations governing fair lending practices and alternative repayment methods, and also commercial contracts. And interestingly, there's requirements to have like witness testimony when contracts were signed and proper documentation of business agreements. So, all things that, yes, they are ancient, but we're still doing this stuff today. So, it's really not that far removed. As I wrote in my notes, the ancients aren't as ancient as we think. So, getting into what's the legacy of this Mesopotamian stuff that we've been talking about today? I was thinking about it. The accounting principles that were developed really established fundamental concepts that are still used a lot today. And I got a couple of them here just as an example. So the first one is documentation requirements. So there was a legal mandate to record all significant transactions. That's why you have cuneiform. That's why you have tablets and scribes. Like these transactions had to be recorded. And yeah, we still have that today. Whenever a customer makes a payment, I'm like, hey, where's the invoice? Where's the documentation for this transaction? They were doing this literally thousands of years ago. Things like standardized measurements. So, as we mentioned in the Kushim story, there's consistent units for weighing, for measuring, and for valuing goods. There were even those exchange rate tablets that we chatted about earlier. So, they were already starting to standardize various commodities and various goods. Now, one legacy I think is interesting, which is internal controls, which essentially is like segregation of duties, verification. What do we say in audit? Like trust but verified, like that kind of thing. So I found some examples where there were multiple layers of scribes. So the scribe that recorded the initial list of payments or receipts was not the same one who prepared the summary records. So you have that stratification, right? You have the preparer, and then you have the reviewer, or in this case, the preparer and the summarizer. So that automatically, that segregation of duties, right? Like we literally have the same controls in audits today. And there's also evidence that records showed small signs next to various numbers, like dots or ticks, which indicated deliberate verification and just like retotaling or tallying up transactions and totals. And you think about it, accountants, we always say like tick and tie, like we had to tick and tie, cross foot, all those kinds of words. And the Mesopotamians were already doing this to make sure that their records were accurate because probably the stakes were higher because their society was just a little bit more frugal in terms of making mistakes. They also had audit trails. So that's why they have a lot of records. They were stored in temples that had systems for storing all these types of information. So it had audit trails and also professional standards. So we went all into like what it took to actually become a scribe. It wasn't just anyone off the street could just call themselves a scribe. It was very rigorous training that they had to do. And it's like today becoming a CPA isn't easy. You have to go to college, get all these credits, take all these exams, work for a year, then get your license. It's like this whole process. And the total years required is almost like kind of the same for what's required for these ancient scribes. So, yeah, that's a lot, but hopefully you guys learned all about ancient Mesopotamia and the accounting. But Courtney and I wanted to have a quick conversation as well about, we're thinking about how can we tie back this conversation about the ancients to modern day crypto accounting, right? Because that's what we do at a hash basis. And not only crypto accounting, but just like modern accounting in general. So, yeah, Courtney, you were bringing up something really interesting on the concept of tokens, right? Because the ancients, they had their clay token system, but in crypto, obviously token is like a word that we use all the time as well. So, yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I just try to compare the challenges that we face working with digital assets compared to ancient accounting in Mesopotamia and how they handled things. And I guess just like not being able to search for a transaction or easily categorize a transaction or easily relocate to the correct class or adjust things of that nature, what they had to do compared to what we are able to do every day with digital assets and the technology that we're given. It is interesting to actually see the full life cycle of a clay token develop into the clay tablets, then form, and then here we are now into double entry accounting with digital assets. I just think how it all transpired to where we are now and the challenges that I complain about, but hearing the challenges that they had to deal with, I don't think is fair. I just like to be able to correlate the two and how we got to where we are today, I guess. I think that was really cool in this episode of the whole entire life cycle of it.
Yeah, and we definitely have it better today, right? At least in our transactions, we have hashes. So we're able to look at the unique identifier. I think that probably would have been a lot harder back then, especially with just the nature of all these loose tokens everywhere. But one parallel I also did want to draw is that, yeah, the tokens were kind of the first step on a longer evolution, part of a longer journey to actually having writing. You know, the tokens, and then that kind of graduated to full blown cuneiform. And just a parallel in crypto, we're still really early in the industry. It still is like relatively new. And so maybe the tokens that we're all talking about and transacting in are still just the early phases that we're at as the crypto industry grows and expands. I got the new Solana Seeker phone. I keep talking about it, it's like everybody, but even setting up the wallet, I had to write down my seed phrase on a piece of paper and then put that in a safe. And it was just so manual. And I'm like, wow, I can't believe we're still doing this. And so maybe as we look thousands of years into the future, we'll still have crypto, but it won't be as manual and laborious as it is today. Because even with crypto transactions, as you know, like it's still sometimes like finding a needle in a haystack, and a lot of the technology is still not developed on the accounting side. So, yeah, definitely just wanted to draw some parallels there and just make the point that we're still pretty early.
What new skills do you think are required for crypto accountants that wouldn't have mattered in ancient Mesopotamia for the scribes back then?
Yeah, it's a great question because as I'm thinking about this, a lot of the skills are actually the same, right? Because these scribes had to be extremely detail oriented. They had to go to school for a while. They had to deal with large volumes of data and documentation, things like the internal controls that we mentioned. So, honestly, the accountants of 5,000 years ago don't seem a whole lot different, at least to me, than the accountants of today. It just seems like the medium is different. We're not working with clay tablets, we're working with bits and bytes and all the computer stuff, transaction hashes, but the basic principles or the fundamentals appear to be very similar. Now, I'm not talking about like double entry because, of course, they didn't have double entry. So that's a separate skill set, more of a trade, in my opinion, but I'm talking more about the core concepts like the documentation, controls, audit trails. Those actually, I think, translate pretty well to modern day. But yeah, what do you think?
I agree. I found it fascinating to see, like physically see the tablets and things of that sort in your research, the correlation between the two, the documentation, the internal controls, the audit trail. I thought that was really fascinating to go back and be able to be like, oh, yeah, this is every day. This is how we do it. This correlates just to what they did thousands of years ago. So I found that very interesting. But yeah, I would have to agree with you. Even with our technology today, I do believe the skill set is still extremely comparable to that of a scribe back then and what they had to encounter. We have to be very educated on the digital asset side of things with it being an emerging area, technology, finance, however you would like to label it. But I think that also correlates to how civilizations back then in Mesopotamia felt going to temples and dealing with scribes, right? They felt they had to have, I assume, feel that sense of comfort, giving them all their goods, trusting them with all their goods, similar to businesses and accountants today.
Yeah, that's a great point. It seems like the public definitely has a certain level of trust in accountants. But yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed those discussion questions. We thought it was just interesting, going from all this ancient history and then trying to tie that back or at least find parallels to the type of work that you and me are doing every day. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us. Courtney, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me on LinkedIn, just Courtney Paul.
And I'm Mackenzie Thoda on LinkedIn. You can find me there as well. And definitely check out Hashbasis. It's hashbasis.xyz is our website. We just did a huge website update and rebrand. So yeah, I would appreciate y'all checking it out. So thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.